Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today in the podcast, I talk about the rights of Christ the King and the real reason why authority in the church, or the real reason why there's a crisis in the church, what has to do with authority. And we're going to get into that for about 45 minutes. But before I do that, I want to say that I am going to be speaking in just about 3 weeks' time in Athlone in Ireland. And I promise I won't do a cheesy Irish accent, but instead, I'll play the promotional video of a gentleman who has a real Irish accent about the conference. Goodness gracious, I can't even present today.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, why not join us for the 2024 SSPX Annual Conference. This year's conference takes place in the Sheraton Hotel Athlone on Saturday, August 31st. The day will start with Low Mass at 8 a.m. in Corpus Christi Church, just a short walk from the conference venue. The opening address will be given by our prior, the Reverend Father Abbey. This will be followed by the morning talks given by the District Superior of Britain and Ireland, Father David Cherry, and one of the Society's own religious sisters. Then after lunch there will be a talk given by the former editor of Principio magazine, Mrs. Gina Connolly, followed by our keynote speaker, the renowned Mr. Kennedy Hall. There will be tea and coffee served during the day, and in the evening after the rosary there will be refreshments served, and you will have the opportunity to relax and converse with our guest speakers. Why not book online and get the early bird price? Looking forward to seeing you there. God bless.
So check out the SSPX conference in Ireland. The link for that is in the description area of this podcast. The link to sign up is there. Hopefully, I will see you on the Emerald Isle. And if you do enjoy Kilkenny as much as I do, I would love to, not the county, I've never been to the county, but the red ale. If you do enjoy the nectar of the Irish nation, Kilkenny, as much as I do, I'd love to share a cup or 5 or 6 or 7, depending how many we get through with you there. All right, let's get to the show. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about the crisis in the church. Of course, you've heard the crisis in the church spoken about 1,000 different times. So in some ways, you're thinking to yourself, another podcast on the crisis in the church. Well, I want to take an angle today that I think is a little bit different and what truly lies behind the crisis. And we're going to look at a couple things from differences between the way things were understood about very fundamental doctrines before the council and how they were understood in the council and since then, and the effects that those have on our society writ large because of where they stem from, especially the society of the church, which is a perfect society. Definitionally so, the church is a perfect society because it has everything it needs to sustain itself. This is why, for example, the family is not a perfect society because it must look outside of itself for what it needs fundamentally, whereas the church contains everything it needs for itself. That's why we call the church a perfect society. At any rate, the society of the church, the civil society that we live in, are struggling right now from a massive crisis. It's not just in the church with liturgy and doctrine and so forth. It is in society with all of the insane perversions of the natural law and even just the basic nonsensical policies and ways that politicians act. I mean, we all remember what it was like to live through the COVID crisis time when basic reason was just completely disallowed and canceled and labeled misinformation and no one could ask questions and so forth. And these things have a lot of us scratching our heads. And often we look to the situation in the society writ large and in the church, and we ask ourselves, what can we do? Is there a political solution and so forth? And while I'm not one to be black-pilled, I don't believe that being black-pilled, so to speak, sort of writing everything off as being rigged and controlled by some cabal or cult or whatever. I don't think that that's necessarily the right approach because I think it's a little bit too deterministic and fatalist, which leaves aside free will and God's providence, and I think that's a problem and leads to despair. Nonetheless, I understand the implication to go there considering how wicked things have become in society and in the church. And you sit there scratching your head saying, where is this coming from? How is there a way out? What are we going to do? Well, I mean, I don't have the perfect answer, but I think that we can look to some very fundamental aspects of church tradition and just the basic understanding of the order of creation and understand why. And last night I was having a conversation with a priest friend of ours, and he was over for dinner, and we were talking. And we were talking about the various things that are, problems. We are encountering this, we're encountering that. This is what someone's saying about this. And, all the things, all the crises things that we are talking about all the time, whether it's in the general civil society or in the society of the church. And this priest is a very smart man. He kept coming back and he said, this is the root of the crisis. The crisis in the church is a crisis of authority. And that is something that I think is often overlooked by people, because in our day, in our very liberal societies, and I mean liberal in the sense of our classic liberalism that oversees our societies, the notion of authority as such, before we even get to government, the notion of authority has been relegated to something like an overseer who stops other people from hurting each other, and that's basically it. And admittedly, I have many of those inclinations as well. Anyone who's heard me talk about my political leanings, I very much lean towards the sort of libertarian, very small government kind of mentality. I don't accept all of the things that every libertarian would say, because many of them are just liberals. But nonetheless, that sort of political intuition speaks to me a lot. This notion of sort of a limited scope of authority from the state is something that I agree with. However, there's a big difference between the sort of liberal mindset that oversees our political and ecclesiological thinking, which is erroneous, and the mindset of wanting to establish the proper order of authority. So, for example, when someone like myself says I want a government that's about as small as the amount of employees at your local post office, which would be a dream of mine, I don't mean that because I don't want any rules and I don't want anyone to have any jurisdiction over everything. It's because I want authority to be stronger in its proper domain, which is very much in line with the Catholic understanding of subsidiarity, where the various levels that must deal with problems that are particular to them have the jurisdiction to do so. And historically, the church has always dealt with that. And the church has had a very sort of subsidiarity mindset. This notion that the Pope is something like a sort of central CEO of a corporation who kind of just puts out policy documents and smacks down employees who get out of line, and that's kind of all he does, combined with this false notion that he's basically a divine oracle. This is very antithetical to the long-standing understanding of authority and what it is. So here is what I mean by the crisis of authority. I was talking to this priest, and we were going back to this idea that there's this crisis of authority, and we were bringing up specific examples. A family in this situation doesn't really know what to do, and a family in that situation doesn't really know what to do. And he said, the church has always understood historically when there was proper authority, and the proper authority was exercised. And remember, we understand that the scriptures tell us that all authority has its source in God. He is the author, and therefore authority is from him. Everyone in a particular state, whether they're a bishop, a parish priest, a father, a businessman, etc., you have what are called graces of your state. So you are the one who should properly be dealing with and fixing problems that pertain to your area. What has happened in the last while in the church, we could go back to the 1800s and talk about some of the, notions of the papacy that became common and were debated and so forth. That's another conversation for another day, but you could check out the work of Dr. Kwasniewski and all those who wrote in the book that he edited called Ultramontanism and Tradition, which I think gives the best real spirited Catholic debate, orthodox in the sense of within the bounds of orthodoxy over the question. And at a certain point, we got lazy and complacent to the degree that we began to look at the Pope, just like we began to look at our presidents and our prime ministers, as basically these oracles who would sort of control the whole thing through making decisions. And this is completely antithetical to how a Catholic has always understood authority. The church has always understood authority with the lens of the graces of state of particular regions, jurisdictions, and even parishes. So this is why people will say, you notice that in the church today, when people want to have an answer to a question, they can't often go to their bishop. So what do? Well, they go around to different online priests and idiots on the internet like myself. And as I've said this 1,000 times, I just want the crisis in the church to end. I don't want there to be a need for Catholic podcasters like myself. I would like to go back to just teaching in real Catholic schools, so I would like them to come back into existence so I could do that. I love what I do now, but I'm just kind of being facetious. And this is a very strange phenomenon, this idea that we're not able to find the true answers from our local priest or our local bishop, and we have to go looking somewhere else. Now, there's a corollary to that as well, because a lot of Catholics who kind of fall into the camp of, I'll ask my priest and whatever he says is gospel. In a sense, they're going from a very natural inclination, which is very Catholic, in the sense that they want to get the answer from the man who has the grace of state to help them with their question. But the problem is that we live in an age where Catholics writ large are so poorly formed because of these men having been derelict in their duty largely, as well as heads of families who have been derelict in their duty to pick up what is lacking. And because of this, you can't just go to your local parish priest much of the time. Sometime you can if you have a good priest, and there are many very good priests, and God be praised for that. But the vast majority have been so poorly formed that Catholics are basically out there floundering, looking for some sort of hero. And again, we see this in civil society. Your country has a terrible prime minister or premier of your province or president or whatever, and you look overseas to some political leader. It's amazing to see how many conservatives and right-wingers in general in the world, and I'm one of them, look to the Donald Trump phenomenon with such, fascination, because, again, for all his faults, the man is not the Messiah or anything like that. But the fact that he himself represents sort of the sentiment of all those people looking to have the sort of basic national values that everyone with common sense would have agreed upon 100 years ago. It's very fascinating to see this man as sort of this international political figure that does kind of fulfill this role of this mentorship of authority that people are yearning for. And it's a very fascinating phenomenon to watch. When you don't have proper authority, you have absolute chaos. We can understand this when we look to the created order, the natural world, when we look to sort of the animal kingdom. We all recognize that there are various hierarchies that exist. So, for example, we can all say the lion is the king of the jungle. And why is the lion the king of the jungle? Well, because he basically has no natural predators. Even elephants, as amazing as they are in stature, as grandiose as they are, as magnificent as they are, as much as they can be domesticated for agricultural work and transportation and so forth, and they're a very, very beautiful, special animal, they themselves do have predators. They can be taken down by various hunters or various pack animals and things like that. It doesn't happen very often, but you can see it. Whereas the lion, we look to the lion and we say, the lion is basically the king of the jungle, because he basically has nobody above him. And we see this in children's literature and things where these animals are used as these devices to show sort of this basic natural authority that is built into the created order. And in various stories, we have a good lion. And if we have a good lion, like in Narnia or something like that, then we have a good society. We have a good jungle society. If we have a bad lion, or an animal like a lion, like a tiger in something like the Jungle Book, who is evil and so forth, we have a bad society that is filled with chaos. And there was an interesting a sort of observational study done years ago. You can find this video online. It's been around for at least 15 years. I remember I used to show it to my students to talk about authority and the natural order of things that must be followed for there to be thriving and flourishing. And I believe it was in Yellowstone Park, I think, in the United States. Don't quote me on that, but it was one of these major national parks. And essentially what had happened was these rivers were there was a problem with all of these rivers drying up, and they couldn't stop it from happening. And eventually they kind of realized that the reason why the rivers were drying up was because they had hunted the local wolf population away. And there were reasons why they did, because there was people living near there and the wolves were a nuisance for livestock and things like that. But they had got rid of the natural predator for the deer population and the other, elk and deer-like creatures and things like that. So what was happening? Well, all of these animals going to the water holes without any natural predators and breeding without any culling of the herd that was natural, and the humans couldn't keep up to keep the population down. There wasn't enough hunting. What was happening is that they were going to the riverbeds, and because they were all without fear, just hanging out at the riverbeds, just like it was a vacation. There's no alligators or anything like that in these rivers, and nothing, or crocodiles, I guess is probably the proper one. I think crocodiles are the ones in rivers. But anyway, there was nothing like that to keep their population in check and to spook them away from the riverbeds. So what they were doing is they were causing a lot of erosion on the sides of the riverbed. And it was causing issues with the water levels because it was affecting things like the extent of the tree roots and all these kinds of things that were interconnected. And the rivers themselves were basically drying up as a result. They couldn't do anything to stop. And then one day somebody basically said, maybe it was a team of people, whatever it was, that they were going to reintroduce the wolf population because that was going to restore the natural order to the ecosystem. And what was amazing is that within a few short years, and they found wolves from various areas in Canada, I think, that had the ability to live in a similar climate and so forth that could adapt naturally, and it was totally fine. There were some, member of the species that used to be there. They brought them in. Everything went back to normal. Not only was the population of the deers quelled and things like that, what also happened was that the actual natural ecosystem itself, it was renewed and reestablished and now continues to thrive to this day. Why is that? Because there is the natural the order of creation, the created order of authority in that particular ecosystem has been reestablished, and therefore the whole thing, the whole organism can thrive. When we are lacking this properly ordered, created reality, then everything starts to go into chaos. And when you see that, you begin to see continual fomenting of confusion, disorder, and anarchy in whatever society is lacking that authority. And that is what we have seen in the church. On the one hand, the popes of recent years, Benedict not so much, but in fairness to him, but John Paul II and Pope Francis, they have been in many ways completely derelict in their duty, or John Paul II and Pope Francis, I don't know if I misspoke there, but John Paul II and Pope Francis have basically permitted all type of disorder. I mean, you look back to the time of John Paul II, I know that there's this veneer that John Paul II was the sort of great missionary pope and all these kinds of things because he would travel. And yes, he had this persona that he was this magnanimous character. Nonetheless, when you actually look at what happened in the structures of the church, I mean, he did certain things to stop certain disorders, but there's an expression that Cardinal Gagnon, who was trusted by Paul VI to do the investigation into the Roman Curia to see who were Freemasons, he was a very respected clergyman, and he used the expression, he said, "Où n'a chat rat règne," where there is no cat, the rat reigns. So it's the English expression of when the cat is gone, the mice come out to play. And all of this time, John Paul II spent going around the world and doing the, presentations and the big masses with 1 million people. All those things I'm sure were very edifying for people. But all the while, the dad was going off and he was sort of taking care of the externals, but the interior continued to rot. It was sort of like, I was talking to someone who spent a long time in China, many, many, many years in China. And he was talking about going to the old city in Beijing, I think. Please, if I'm wrong, if it's a different one, but I think it was Beijing. Sort of the old historic city. He said it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing to see how they've been able to maintain all of the ancient architecture. And it's just this breathtaking, like stereotypical, it's like you're watching something from Mulan or something like that. It's just perfectly aesthetically pleasing, very historically beautiful Chinese thing. And he said, but when you go up to the carved wooden ornamentation and decorations that adorn everything, he says what you'll see if you pay attention, because no one's allowed to touch them, that these government employees are constantly repainting these things, constantly. And he asked himself, why are they constantly repainting these things? And he would go to these things and eventually he got close enough to look because you're not supposed to touch them. And he realized they use this very strong, very shiny, shimmery, very metallic paint that was layered on in a almost thicker than the wood. And basically the wood underneath was completely rotten and everything was being kept afloat and kept with the externals as being sound by this ornamentation and decoration, but the thing was rotting from the inside. And that's kind of an analogy of what happened during the papacy of John Paul II. There was this external expression that the church herself was in this state of health because there was this revival of the personality of the Pope. There was this revival of the external manifestation of the Pope to the world. And therefore, there was this illusion that the church was strong. However, as we realized, especially later in John Paul II's life, with the massive revelations of the abuse allegations and all these sorts of things and the shoddy record of all the bishops underneath him and all this kind of stuff, we realize, sadly, even though there was this seeming revival, what it was a revival on the externals because the heart of the matter and the root cause, the problem was still there. And what was that cause? It was the absence of authority. And under Pope Francis, I mean, obviously this is here. Goodness gracious, look who's allowed to, James Martin can basically run around in the church and do whatever he wants and spread his homo heresies, but traditionalists are the enemy. I mean, this is something I probably don't even have to explain to any of you at all because you see it every single day. But at the same time, what happens when authority is derelict in its duty? What happens is it's natural for someone in authority to lay down a heavy hand when there is chaos. But what happens is when the chaos is completely widespread and is ubiquitous and intrinsic to everything, which it is at all layers in the church today, then the manifestation of the heavy-handed authority of the church, and the authority of whoever is in authority, which can be very useful, it is never applied equitably. And when it is applied, it looks selective and it further delegitimizes the authority. This is what happened, for example, with Bishop Vigano. I'm going to have Dr. Mazza on, who is a supporter of Bishop Vigano. And I'm neither a supporter nor a non-supporter of Bishop Vigano. I've said, in the sense that I've said, I don't believe Bishop Vigano is a schismatic for all of the reasons that I've enumerated in many places. I don't agree with his declarations on Pope Francis not being the Pope, but there's a reason why I say I don't believe Sedevacantists as individuals are schismatics, because I believe that we are in a confusing time where there is this massive confusion about the person of the Pope and the papacy itself. And I don't think Catholics are going to be judged based on their conclusion they come to that I may disagree with. That is a possible conclusion at a time when possible conclusions are considered because of the fact that things are so disordered within the church. That's just kind of how I look at it. Many of Bishop Vigano's doctrinal statements I'm completely in accord with when he criticizes things in the Second Vatican Council and so forth. So personally, I don't think he's a schismatic. But let's just say you would think that Bishop Vigano is a schismatic. And there are various traditionally minded or traditional Catholic commentators and so forth, like Eric Sammons. I think he believes Bishop Vigano is a schismatic. I think Eric Ibarra, to use another Eric, I really respect Eric Ibarra's work. I think he's really good at what he does. And I think he said he believes it as well. But Eric Ibarra made an amazing observation when the whole thing happened. And he made the observation that I'm basically going to make right now, in that what we have seen is that even if you think that the authority of the papacy, the authority of the church, should be used against Bishop Vigano, the problem is that it looks completely selective, disingenuous, and further delegitimizes the authority, because while they're going after this, problematic bishop who may have gone too far, there are a zillion other bishops who maybe they're not putting out declarations, but they have direct jurisdiction over souls and priests in their diocese, and they're allowing all manner of heresy, immorality, sacrilege, ecumenism, and so forth to flourish, and do nothing to stop it, and they continue on with their day job. Same thing with going after Bishop Strickland. Bishop Strickland, I don't think he should have been removed from his diocese by any stretch of the imagination. But of course, they went after Bishop Strickland. They smack him down, and he is this, wicked man who's, gone too far and blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, down the road at a different part of Texas, you have a bishop, basically talking like Kamala Harris about the need to bring in all the migrants and, just parroting woke talking points. And he's a bishop of the Catholic Church. He's a successor of the apostles, and his way of thinking is more similar to Kamala Harris's than the apostles. And that's a huge problem. And that man should be smacked down if there is going to be any use of authority. And this is one of the symptoms of a lack of authority. We see this in the civil sphere as well. We saw this in Canada with the Freedom Convoy, if you remember that. I obviously was very pro Freedom Convoy, but even if one were to say the Freedom Convoy people went too far and they should have not sort of occupied the downtown streets of Ottawa for as long as they did, okay, fine. Have that opinion if you believe. But the problem is that you had this prime minister of a country who was allowing and facilitating and encouraging, he was allowing his ministers underneath of him and so forth, and all of his various jurisdictions, to completely subjugate an entire subset of the population and destroy the economy and ruin people's lives, and never did anything to stop it and encouraged it. And then out of nowhere comes in with his heavy hand because he wants to restore order to the country, but he's the one who largely created the disorder in the first place. And all it did was further delegitimize the authority of the prime minister in my country. And that's been reflected in the fact that before the COVID lockdowns, Justin Trudeau's approval ratings were high enough that he would likely win again. And now they're kind of the lowest in, I think, the history of the Liberal Party. They're through the floor. I mean, he's in third or fourth party status at this point, which will be a happy day when he's gone, but he's not gone yet. This is just one of many examples. And the problem is that this attack on authority, which is ultimately an attack on the kingship of Christ, has been instantiated into the documents of the Second Vatican Council. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that here. So I want to say shout out to a channel called I Miss Christendom. The gentleman who does that channel is very good. And he recently did a video called Father Chris Alar is Wrong About the SSPX. And we're not going to go into the SSPX thing here, but we're going to go into what he talked about when he provided these citations, which thank you, Mr. I Miss Christendom, for providing the citations here, because it's easier for me to just show these couple slides on this video rather than having to go through the documents and comb through them myself. So what am I getting at here? So this is the syllabus of errors from Pope Pius IX, Blessed Pope Pius IX. And these are errors. So saying this is an error. It is against the Catholic faith. This error. Every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. That's an error. Number 24 from the syllabus. The church has not the power of using force, nor has she any temporal power, direct or indirect. So, according to Blessed Pope Pius IX, who was establishing these as official errors that Catholics ought not believe because they're against the faith, and one can quibble over whether or not the syllabus of errors was infallible or not. It definitely represented the consensus of the universal and ordinary teaching of the popes and the history of the church. So there's an argument for sure to be made that it was infallible. Nonetheless, in order to dissent against it, you'd have to provide some overwhelming consensus that there was another aspect of the ordinary teaching, which clearly has not been done. In any event, so that's the syllabus of errors. Now, if we just go to what the Second Vatican Council says, here is a citation from one of the documents. And it says, in all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God, the end and purpose of his life. It follows that he is not to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience, nor, on the other hand, is he to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in matters of religion. So let's just go back here. Every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. That's error number 1. Error number 2, the church has not the power of using force, nor has she any temporal power, direct or indirect. Compare that to this error. In all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God and to the end and purpose of his life. It follows that he is not to be forced to act in any manner contrary to his conscience, nor, on the other hand, is he to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in religious matters. Again, look at these two errors. It is an error to say that every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, meaning his conscience, he shall consider true. And it's an error to say that the church has not the power of using force, nor has she any temporal power, direct or indirect. And these are just two of the errors that our friend over there did. Other errors. In the present day, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be held as the only religion of the state to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. That's an error. Another error. Hence, it has been wisely decided by law in some Catholic countries that persons coming to reside therein shall enjoy the public exercise of their own peculiar worship. Sorry, I had to pause there for a second when my toddler was having a bad moment. In any event, the syllabus of errors, again, let's read that again. In the present day, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be held as the only religion of the state to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. Next error, hence it has been wisely decided by law in some Catholic countries that persons coming to reside therein shall enjoy the public exercise of their own worship. These are errors. We are not supposed to believe these as Catholics. And we go to the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly. So, It continues, government therefore ought indeed take into account the religious life of the citizenry and show it favor, since the function of government is to make provision for the common welfare. However, and sorry, I'll pause there. This is why Vatican II is so difficult, because that sentence is perfectly fine. Government must take into account religion, but the true religion, and that is part of the common welfare. However, it would clearly transgress the limits set to its power were it to presume to command or inhibit acts that are religious. That's not true. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby a society is governed, and thus is to become a civil right. So if we compare the teachings of the church before the council that were called errors, and we compare the teachings of the council, at least in a couple spots, what we find that the council was promoting things that were strongly opposed, if not in flat-out contradiction to what were seen as the consensus for ages and ages and ages by many, many popes and saints and everything, and common sense and reason. They were in contradiction with one another. Now, here is the problem. Again, this gets to the heart of authority. Because if we understand that the world, the universe, the created order as such was created by the author, and that within this created order there is a hierarchy and an order of things, which we do see again in the natural world, and we'll see that in the supernatural and preternatural. We have a hierarchy of angels, for example. Even with demons, we have something like a lowerarchy of demons. There's sort of a reverse pyramid, if you want to call it that. These statements from the Second Vatican Council strike at the heart of authority. It is as if the Church at the Council, and since then in her non-infallible yet promulgated magisterial documents, has decided to cast aside the notion that the supreme authority is Christ over society writ large. And if Christ is the authority, which the Second Vatican Council seems to deny, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, then what we have is a situation where we're saying Christ does not reign, which is completely contrary to all Catholic thought for all centuries. Yes, there have been examples of permissions and tolerations in the sense of, for the sake of the common peace of a given society, certain people will be allowed to, have their places of worship, or maybe have more sort of private ceremonies and things like that, rather than sort of unnecessarily disturbing the peace in a way that's ineffective. That's just a prudential decision. But this notion that everyone has the right to religious liberty is saying that everyone has the right to follow his own conscience and go after whichever God he wants, which is to strike at the authority of God himself. Because if God is the authority, and he is, then he has the power. And the church does have direct and indirect power. And this has been long established in some of the great authors on Catholic social teaching, Catholic social principles, like Father Fahey and others. The church does have direct authority over souls and things that pertain to religious matters, and religious matters are parts of civil society. And she has indirect authority, I should say, over things that are not specifically pertaining to purely religious matters, but things that intersect. So, for example, the church does not have the authority, or does not exercise a direct authority, I should say, to tell your country which way of doing government they must adopt, because there are various acceptable means. But she does have the indirect authority to say that no government will be permitted by the law of God to do X, Y, and Z, and that power of coercion, it is a power of coercion. That power of coercion is very real, and she shows those things with various means. So, for example, a Catholic state, a Catholic head of state will be excommunicated if he does X, Y, and Z, for example. Again, how is it that no one has excommunicated Joe Biden, for example? Yet they go after Bishop Vigano. Again, we just see the inconsistencies here. And this is at the heart of the crisis. And until this crisis in authority ends, there will be no renewal, reformation, reestablishment, revitalization, revival, whatever term you want to use. There will be no reestablishment of the authority in the proper manner. And what we will continue to see is crisis and chaos and anarchy, because ou n'a chat ra règne. When the cat is gone, the rat reigns as king. And we do see that now. The rats in the church are reigning over their little kingdoms and causing havoc and destruction and terror and tyranny in the lives of Catholics. And Catholics are now in a state where they must go looking for authority wherever they can find it. And this is a necessity. This is a necessity. This is why the SSPX is justified, for example, just like St. Eusebius of Samosata was justified during the Arian crisis to go into different dioceses and do things as a bishop that he wouldn't otherwise have the permission to do because there was a crisis of authority during the Arian crisis. Every heretical crisis is a crisis of authority. This is why, for example, you look to the writings of St. Paul. There are crises of heresy in various regions of the early church. And St. Paul comes down, and what does he do? He deals with those crises and establishes the authority of sound doctrine and of the church, and those crises dissipate and go away, even if they go underground or go different places and spread somewhere else. But in the region where he has his authority, the various places he wrote his letters to in the New Testament, Corinth and all those places, you see the reestablishment and the reaffirmation of Christ's authority through his ministers, through his apostles. And that is completely lacking in our day. I mean, how many documents have you seen your local bishop put out about ecumenism or environmentalism or even Eucharistic revival? I'm happy that the authorities in the church in America want to do some sort of Eucharistic revival. But it's not going to work in the long run because there is this growing consensus that is established amongst basically all Catholics, because most Catholics, there have been a few things in my sort of professional apologetic commentariat career, whatever you want to call it, that I do. There have been a few things that have garnered me the most hate from critics. One is when I went after evolution, because evolution is the creation myth of the modernists, and they hate when you go after that. Number two is when I defend the SSPX, because the SSPX stands for tradition, and the modernists hate tradition. Number three is when I go after the charismatic renewal, because the charismatic renewal really is the archetypal modernist religion, because it's all about feelings and experience and continual revelation, which is what modernism is par excellence. And number four is when I go after the notion of religious liberty. I've been writing articles for Crisis. Eric Sammons, thank you very much for allowing me to make your life a living hell by writing various articles going after religious liberty and so forth. And the comments that I get from many Catholics, and we're not talking about Nancy Pelosi Catholics. We're talking about Catholics who would be pro all the morals of the church and pro-life and pro-marriage and believe in the Eucharist and, believe the basic doctrines. But even these Catholics, largely because of the way of the formation has been since the council, have completely imbibed the completely heretical and erroneous notion that all religions have the same rights as the true religion, which is to say that the devil has the same rights as Christ, which is impossible. I mean, this shouldn't be hard to understand. It is impossible to say that the devil has the same rights as Jesus Christ. If you have a positive religious liberty in the sense that it's established as what all people are given by their divinely inspired conscience, however you want to put it, then that means no one can really be in error, because if they have the right to their conscience that can never be co-opted, then we have to believe that the conscience itself is some sort of divine conduit that brings this person to God in the way that God has seen fit for their life, which leads to an unadulterated religious relativism, which leads to ecumenism, which leads to every ridiculous thing that we've seen in the church, culminating with the Sisi with John Paul II, and most recently with the Pachamama and Abu Dhabi statement and all these kinds of things coming out of Pope Francis's pontificate. And many of these Catholics are scratching their heads, not realizing that until we establish the true reign of Christ the King as the authority over heaven and earth, not just heaven, and that authority is imminent to our domain, whether direct through certain measures of coercion that the church has the right to establish through her direct authority, or indirect through various measures of coercion over Catholics who are in positions of direct authority. Until that is reestablished, there will be no fixing of the crisis. And this is what Archbishop Lefebvre stood for. Yes, Archbishop Lefebvre stood for the Mass, because the Mass is the touch point of our religious lives with the divine things of God, and therefore the Mass is fundamental, and a deficient liturgy is not acceptable. But more importantly than that, as the main source of his crusade against modernism, you can see this in his book, They've Uncrowned Him, which is essentially, they call it Lefebvre's Summa, meaning the greatest work of his life, and comparing it to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, not saying it's of the same caliber, but saying that it is in that vein of a summarization, a summa of all of the doctrines on a particular issue and something like a magnum opus on that issue itself. Archbishop Lefebvre stood for the rights of Christ the King because when there was an ignorance of the rights of Christ the King, society crumbles as fast as the church. And society itself will not be saved by some quote unquote conservative government. It will not be saved by classic liberalism, etc. Those things may be placeholders to make things less insane, but it won't restore the true sanity, which is only found in the reestablishment of the rights of Christ the King. And that's it. There's no way out. There is not another way out than that. And until that is established by the authorities of the church, we're up the creek without a paddle, as they say. Now, there is some good news. The good news is that human beings naturally respond to authority, for better or for worse. We saw this during the COVID crisis. How many people do you know that lost their ever-loving minds because Anthony Fauci or whatever idiot, depending on your country, came out, or public health official, whoever it was, and started saying things about viruses, and no one stopped to ask themselves and be like, is this the truth? Is there a second opinion? Does this person even know what they're talking about when it comes to viruses? It didn't matter because the authority said it. Now, that was an abuse of authority, and it was a lemming-like, mindless, mind-numbingly ignorant and stupid following of that abuse of authority by so many people, which caused so much harm in people's lives. Nonetheless, what does it represent? It represents that it's like what Christ says. When you scatter the sheep, when you strike the sheep, they all scatter. They respond to the stick, for better or for worse. If the stick is being used to lead them to the place of chaos, they will go headlong into chaos like sheep off a cliff. If the shepherd comes and calls the sheep away, he says, my sheep know me, my flock hears me, they know me. If he calls them away from the cliff, they'll also come to there. All that is required in the basic sense, in the most basic sense, all that is required to reestablish order in the church and to have a return to tradition is to establish the rights of Christ the King. I mean, I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but that is the crux of the matter. Because once you establish the rights of Christ the King, once you establish the true nature of authority, the spiritual and natural hierarchy that has been put into creation and is unavoidable both in the spiritual and natural realm, the supernatural and the preternatural and the natural. Once that is established, everything follows. Here's why. No one is going to go to the Novus Ordo, for example, and say, this is a liturgy befit for a king, because that concept is missing, is completely absent from why the Novus Ordo exists. It's for the people, not for the Christ. Christ is there as a service to us so we can get our sacraments, whereas the liturgy is supposed to be there as a service to Christ so that he can so his kingly, majestic sacrifice can be represented to demonstrate the salvific power of God that we can unite ourselves to in a vertical sense rather than in a horizontal sense. And that's completely lost. When you reestablish the rights of Christ the King, then you say to yourself, we must have a kingly liturgy. When you reestablish the rights of Christ the King, you say to yourself, we need to have vertical, not horizontal, meaning looking up, not looking sideways, catechesis about the supernatural order as having preeminence over the natural order, and so on and so forth. Economies follow, families follow. When there is a lack of authority, everything crumbles, and the Catholics of the Church are left to try to pick up the pieces themselves, which will continually lead to fomenting divisions and confusions between people, because so-and-so will have no authority from his local parish who doesn't want to deal with these matters. So he goes over to so-and-so's priest on YouTube or this book or that book, and they just kind of pick and choose, almost like Protestants, finding people proof texting the things that give them a good feeling about they can confirm them in whatever doctrine they want to believe that makes their life easier. So if they want to find someone who says the SSPX is in schism, they'll say, well, Father so-and-so said it. I don't have to think for myself now. If they want to believe that Vatican II is the bee's knees and nothing greater ever happened in the church, they can find some Nouvelle Theologie theologian, which, by the way, at some point I'll probably go after the Nouvelle Theologie, which might be number 5 on my list. Remember, it was Evolution, Society of St. Pius X, Charismatic Renewal, and kingship of Christ have been the four main things I've talked about, and those are the things I've gotten the most heat for. I imagine when I one day go after the Nouvelle Theology, which I do in my modernism book, and I'll probably do that publicly at some point. When I do that eventually, I'll probably get a lot of heat from that as well. It might be the most heat I've ever gotten based on what's the sort of zeitgeist in the church right now. Nonetheless, they can find anyone to justify any position. They can find anyone to justify any position. And because there's no authority, everyone is like their own individual little pope, their individual little king, sitting around saying, I have what I need to make me feel good about what I believe about religion. You can't tell me otherwise because my authority said this. And this is the extent of liberalism. And Archbishop Lefebvre talked about this, and they've uncrowned him. And he says they are like individual kings, meaning every individual person comes off as if he himself is his own king. And this creates continual division and fracturing. And we're seeing the results of this in the UK right now, where for all their faults of the Anglican Church has many faults, they at least had this veneer of the establishment of the Christian religion as the official religion of the state longer than most other countries. And since their bishops, even though they're false bishops, but they still have this representation of being religious leaders, since they become complete and utter woke-tards, embracing all of the errors of the left, you now see Muslim hordes basically taking over the entire country. And now the Archbishop of Canterbury himself is coming down against the quote-unquote radical right-wingers, who in general are largely just people who want the kingship of Christ, and they yell this in public, Christ is king. And they want to reestablish the Christian order of England, which is completely natural. And if you think about it, again, think about the heat that Candace Owens got last year when she started saying Christ is king. Even the Christians, the evangelicals, were calling her an anti-Semite. Why? Because evangelicals are liberals, because all Protestants are liberals, and America is a liberal country in the sense that it's based off of classic liberalism, and everyone in a liberal country is seen as an individual king. When you say things like we the people, quote unquote, unquote, et cetera, as the starting point for the documents, basically give the authority to the leaders of the country. What you're saying is that the authority comes from each one of us as individuals. It's bottom up and not top down. And therefore, there is no room for the kingship of Christ if I don't want it. Christ is king if I want it. He's not king if I don't want it. And you have to leave me alone because don't tread on me. And that's exactly what we do see in society. And it's leading to these damnable errors that are making it crumble around us as we speak. All right. I think that's enough. That was a 45-minute rant without much of a break. So in any event, if you'd like to hear more, I am doing a book study right now on They've Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Lefebvre at my Substack. And I'll just show you that real quickly here. We're going over this book in a book study format. And here, I'll just bring up this episode here without playing it. And you can see here, if you go to my Substack, there's me in my former podcast studio, my dungy little basement, which I'm now not using anymore for this. Thank goodness. I like seeing the sunlight. And you can see here, it's They've Uncrowned Him. And this is number 4 that is up. I'm going to be doing another one this week. And we talk about the various chapters and things like that in the book. And there you go. So check out my Substack. The link for that is in the description area. Also, it's available for YouTube members as well. All right. That's everything, my friends. This has been Mere Tradition. Until next time, God bless you all, and I'll see you soon.